Well, we have been asking a couple of questions over the last several weeks. Asking about the purpose of the church. We started with that question, why are you here? Why are we here? Why does the church exist in the world? We looked at the purpose of the church, God's stated purpose. And we asked the question, why are you here? Why are you in church? Why bother showing up Sunday morning? What are you here for? And then we ask the question, why are we here? As we look at Lowry Pilgrim Community Church, why do we exist? Here in Lowry. Why do we meet together? And then the last question, why are you here? Why are you in this church? Why are you a part of this local body of believers? There are other churches in the area. Why not pour into one of those instead? We've been looking at God's given purpose and mandate for the church so that we can answer those questions, so that we can justify our existence and our presence here, so that we can begin to look at these questions that we are asking and make sure that our answer aligns with what God has called us to. The purpose of the church being to glorify God, to make much of God in our minds and the minds of others as we give Him worship, as we give Him honor, as we give Him praise, we proclaim His word, His attributes, His actions, as we glorify Him with a heartfelt expression of worship, as we glorify Him through our obedience. Both Sunday morning and throughout the week. And we looked at how we are to glorify Him through our obedience as we looked at the mandates of the church. The purpose is to glorify God. Okay, how do we do that? We do that through these mandates. We looked at the universal church to begin with as the chosen people of God in 1 Peter 2:9. Peter applies a passage, a statement God makes about the people Israel in the Old Testament and applies it to the church in the New Testament. That we are now the chosen race, the royal priesthood, the holy nation, a people for God's own possession, in order that we may proclaim His excellencies, proclaim His attributes and actions and word into the darkness, and bring those who are in darkness into His marvelous light. We are to represent God in the world. We do that, in part, within the local church by fellowship. And we looked at what fellowship means. Not just spending time together, not just potluck after service, though that is part of it. Fellowship is far more than just some fun time together. It is an intentional act of service. As we look to meet physical needs, to meet emotional needs, and most importantly within the church, to meet spiritual needs. As we call one another not just to service in physical ways, not just to encouraging one another, but also to call one another to holiness. And then we looked last week at the mandate for both the universal and the local church to make disciples. Part of that fellowship is inward, and part of it is outward. We are not just to make disciples, not in the sense of those who follow. We're not just to grab some people and set them in the pew Sunday morning and hope they pick up on what's being said. Rather, we are to be intentional in making disciple makers. To take the next step so that those who are learning in the church are being matured. learning the truths of the gospel, going beyond just those surface level things, not just drinking the milk of the word, but eating solid food, growing and maturing, being equipped for ministry, again, both within and outside of the church, so that, as Paul writes to Timothy, that all will know how they ought to conduct themselves within the household of God. That they'll be able to serve in the way that God has gifted them, serving as whatever part of the body God has equipped them to be, so that they may express those gifts for the common good. And then serving outside of the body, ministering through evangelism in whatever form that may take. Every part of the body working together in order for the body to grow. Teaching, preaching, having those conversations. Even with those outside of the church, those, especially those still lost in darkness. As we mentioned last week, it has to be a communal effort. People don't come to Christ on the first conversation. It takes time, it takes effort, and it takes many people coming together. And all of the church has to be focused on these things if the church is to grow. As we looked at in Ephesians 4, it is the goal of the church to equip the saints to the work of service, to the ministry both within and outside of the church. That is what the church is for. In theory, if I've been successful, we should be able to answer all four of those initial questions as God has ordained. We should be able to answer those questions correctly, scripturally. And we should be saying, as the answer to each of those questions, hopefully, within our own hearts, they line up with what God has called us to. That's the first thing we need to be thinking about. Are my answers the same as God's answers? Why the church exists? Why you are in church? Why this local church exists? And why you have chosen to invest in this body? But as we're thinking about this church, again, going back to the idea of justifying our existence, I want to give us a picture of what the church can become if it fails. This is what is often called negative theology. We describe what something isn't or shouldn't be in order to set clear boundaries on what it should be. And this morning, we're going to look at how churches can fail and end up becoming something else. And I have a little diagram for us, and I apologize if that's not too clear. I was meaning to put it in your notes, and my printing failed somewhat this morning. I meant to have it there on the handouts. But I want to look at this and just kind of get an idea of how the church can turn into something other than a church. By failing in its mandates, failing in its obedience to what God has called us to, and becoming something other, for distortions of what the church is meant to be. And you'll see in each of those quadrants is a different thing. The first in the top, in your top left, is a social club. The top right is a youth group. The bottom right we're going to call a service club. And the bottom left, a monastery. Four things that a church can become by being overemphasized on one aspect or one mandate of the church, something that is good, something that God has called us to, but in so doing, failing in other areas. Now, this is just a visual aid. This is not, an actual graph we can plot points on. It's just to give you a picture. The lines there, if you can't see, on the horizontal axis is outward fellowship or service to the right, and inward fellowship and service. Again, looking at that concept of fellowship, of service, both within the church and outside, meeting those needs, physical, emotional, and spiritual. And then on the vertical axis there is what I'm calling the simple gospel or spiritual maturity. Now, just for clear definition, what I mean by that with the simple gospel is the simple presentation of the truth of God's Word. What you might begin with in evangelism. What we read in Hebrews, we read in Hebrews last week, is the spiritual milk of the Word. To remind you, in Hebrews chapter 5, in verses 12 to 14, we read, "For though by this time you ought to be teachers, you have need again for someone to teach you the elementary principles of the oracles of God. And you have come to need milk and not solid food. For everyone who partakes in milk is not accustomed to the word of righteousness, for he is an infant. But solid food is for the mature, who because of practice have their senses trained to discern good from evil." Now again, I want to make it clear, these are not opposites in the sense that one is good and one is bad, but rather we want to present to children, to new believers, a simple gospel, to give them the milk of the Word. That is good, that is needed, that is part of how we begin the process of making disciples. The other side of that is spiritual maturity. That is the solid food. Both are needed. An infant can't start out with steak. And as a mature man, you cannot be simply drinking milk. But a church can emphasize one over the other. In the same way that we look at the service, whether we serve those within the church or outside, both are necessary. All four of these axis points are good things. They are part of the mandates of the church that we have been looking at. The goal, really, is to be at the center of those crosshairs. The goal is to be right in there, that we are making sure to do all of these things. These are all the mandates of the church, and we should be a part of each. And what happens is that a church can become overly focused on one aspect over another. And distort what the church is meant to be. If taken to an extreme, any one of these can end up losing the purpose of the church in one part of it. So let's start with the social club. What defines a social club? Again, this is a church. They call themselves a church. They claim to be meeting for the purpose of gathering to worship God in some way or another. But they fail in those purposes, those mandates. For the social club, this happens because they tend to be very inwardly focused. They end up looking at the fellowship side, and they love that. They're all about meeting the needs, the physical and the emotional, sometimes the spiritual needs of those within the church. They may, in fact, be very good at helping each other, about coming alongside one another, encouraging one another. Oftentimes, the church social club, at the surface level, gives lip service to the gospel. And most tend to keep it right there up at the surface. They know the truths, they can give the basic Sunday school answer, but in many cases there's fear of going deeper. Fear of growing in maturity, because if they do, the problems in their lives might start to surface. You see, in a social club, people want to look good. look perfect, look put together. It's about spiritually as well as visually keeping up with the Joneses. We can't let anybody know that there's something bad in our lives, or else they're not going to want us in our church, in that church. Another problem with the social club church is that they often are very unwelcoming toward the undesirables, however they might define that. Those who don't look and think like the rest of the club members. They're generally not looking to add to their membership. They don't want you to join unless you can bring something to the club. Influence, money, visibility. What the social club fails in is a love for others, and oftentimes a maturity, because it's simply about what looks good on the surface. Even if the people who attend feel great about themselves while they're there. On the other side of that, in the bottom corner, on the bottom right corner, there is the service club. Now, in a secular scenario, something like the Lions Club or the Lionesses Club, which is a group of people getting together to serve the community, to raise money, to put on events, things like that, those are great. Those are wonderful. It's great to see people coming together for those purposes. And a church can very quickly turn into one of those service clubs with a religious symbol stamped on the front. How does that happen? Well, they become very focused on that outward service. Fulfilling the fellowship mandates going out into the community. They're all about meeting the physical and emotional needs of the disadvantaged, of the poor, of the needy. Though they may not necessarily be as mature as we think of growing deep in theology and being challenged in the Word, they are very others-focused. And that's a wonderful thing. They want to give. They want to be a part of the community and helping to alleviate those difficulties or provide services that may not otherwise be there. The problem with a social club church is that they often mistake the gospel for those helping ministries. They often even fail to present a very simple gospel, the milk of the word, because in the end they become a gospel, a social gospel. One that says being a Christian is about meeting physical needs. We've seen this many times throughout the years. One example of this, and though I don't want to say this is a blanket statement across the board, but what is known as the Salvation Army. This was started around the beginning of the 20th century with the expressed purpose of meeting physical needs. You may not know, but there are actually Salvation Army churches. They're not just the distribution center where they're giving out food or clothing. They actually meet as a church. And very often these churches lack any understanding of the true gospel because they are only focused on those outward services. Again, great and good things, but not what a church has been called to do. The next example of a distorted church is in the top right corner there, and what I'm calling youth group church. I read a book a number of years ago that explained this phenomenon in history. This is something that's really kind of new to our current generation. The book was called The Juvenilization of American Christianity. And in it, the author goes back to the early part of the 20th century and traces how the youth movement became a thing in Western culture and then worked its way into the church. And what he ended up describing is that big church got turned into youth group. Now, I grew up with that term. We had Sunday morning, I would go into Sunday school. And then for the second service, there was what was called big church. That's where the adults went. And then there was little church. That's where the kids were at. Now, when I was growing up, the church that I attended, little church, ended at 6th grade. But that's not always the case. In fact, many times little church goes all the way up to high school and sometimes even colleges, where they're not expected to be a part of big church. They're not expected to be able to sit and listen and take notes. Instead, they have to be entertained. And long story short, what came out of the juvenilization of American Christianity is that church became about entertainment rather than maturing people in the Word. You see, in order to keep kids involved, they had to be entertained. Again, the youth pastor that I interned with called it the flaming poodles and free pizza. We had to keep kids' attention. We had to do games. We had to do crazy things. And maybe we'll spend a few minutes talking about the Bible. And what happened is that as youth group became this exciting game, entertainment-filled thing, is they got to keep a lot of the kids. In fact, they pulled in tons from the neighborhood as well. And then, as soon as they graduated high school, they left in droves. And you can look at the statistics through the 80s, 90s, 2000s, and current. And depending on where you're at and where in the country you are, the statistics end up being in the 85 to 95% range. Kids who grew up going to church, going to youth group, when they graduate high school, when they go into college, never go back to church. Now, why is that the case? Again, you can look at research groups like Barna, who have asked people why they left the church. And most often, the answer to that is, well, because it's boring. They graduated from the entertainment of youth group, they made it to big church, and they realized, wait a second, this isn't what I'm used to. It's boring. And so they left. Or God doesn't seem like He understands what I'm going through. Questions they have that were never answered because they were too busy playing games. So the response was to make big church more like youth group. And we see that in a lot of churches today where you can't really tell much of a difference between big church and little church because it's all one big exciting event. Instead of worship music, there are rock bands and fog machines. Instead of a pastor who presents himself as a teacher, we have the buddy preacher who preaches in jeans and in sandals, teaching about today's issues and how you have followed these 10 steps to fighting your giants like David did. Not to say that there's anything wrong with that image in and of itself, but that's not youth group, that's supposedly worship. That's trying to show somebody that Scripture worship is meaningful and intentional, and yet making it childish and simple. Church becomes about entertainment and not spiritual growth. I'll give you a wonderful example of this. In fact, Emily just, as the children were up here, she said, only in Lowry will you get chicks in church. And I said, oh no. Because my example of this, when we were in California, we drove past two churches, one called Real Life Church, the other called Higher Vision. And I remember one Easter, we couldn't help but, that laugh cry, because at Higher Vision Church, they had big signs up for Easter. Come this Easter for our petting zoo. And at Real Life Church, they had a much bigger poster that said, come this Easter Sunday and see Jerry the giraffe. What? And they actually had a giraffe there that Easter Sunday. And that's what church is in a youth group church. It's entertainment. It is outwardly focused. Don't get that part wrong. They're trying to entice people to come to church, to hear a gospel. And I say a gospel because oftentimes it gets lost. They're so focused on giving just the milk, just the top, just the skimmed bit. It's there, but all you need is Jesus. And I've heard this stated more times than I care to imagine. You don't need theology. It only divides people. All you need is Jesus. Which is a theological statement, but that's beside the point. It's so surface level and it's so entertainment focused that there is no room for spiritual maturity, and those who want any sort of maturity can't stay in a place like that for very long. A youth group church. The last one in the bottom left corner there is a monastery. Now, what is a monastery? Well, a monastery is very good at spiritual maturity and about that inward fellowship and service. People in a monastery church are dedicated to the Word, dedicated to prayer, dedicated to theology, to spiritual growth. They all know the truth. They can not just give you the Sunday school answer, they can really dive into the Word. And more than that, they're good at taking care of their own. They're good at that active fellowship, meeting the physical and emotional and spiritual needs of those within their church. And if you were to stumble across a monastery, you might be impressed by the knowledge and the depth of love and commitment that's there, and you might even want to stay. The problem with monasteries is that they're usually hard to get to and hard to get into. Maybe not physically, but they're often very closed off to outsiders. There are a lot of unwritten rules that you have to be very careful of breaking. I love the song that Harlow and Doreen sang when they came. I couldn't find it, but it was the "Don't Sit in My Pew" song. I'm glad you're here. We love that you're here. Just don't sit in my pew. We're glad you're here. We love that you want to join us, but don't go into the kitchen. Church monasteries have those little rules that when you start breaking them, oh boy, watch out. That sweet old lady turns into something else. And they have very segmented worship practices that the nuns and the monks who go there know them by heart, know what's going to happen, know when to stand, know when to sit, know when to kneel, know the words to that call and response prayer, know how to sing that prayer song thing that they do right before they eat. But for the visitors, there's no help. They either have to stick it out and learn or feel like an outsider for a long time. Or the theology that's discussed may be so deep, so full of Christianese, words and concepts that a baby Christian drowns, not being able to stand above the waterline, and starves because there's no milk that they need. What you end up with is a great light of a church that's hidden under a basket or way out in the fields where that light does no one any good, because though it shines bright, it's unshared, intentionally or unintentionally. In each of these cases, these four different types of distorted church, there are good things to be seen. They've latched on to one of those mandates of the church, and they've become all about that one thing. The problem is they do that one thing to the detriment of everything else. And God has not called the church to one simple thing. It is a complex, in some ways, a balancing act. Now, some churches will naturally lean one direction more than another because of the way that God has gifted them, because of the way that God has equipped the individual members of the church, or maybe just because of the culture that they find themselves in. They may tend toward leaning one of these directions or another. And again, that's not entirely a problem, but what is necessary, just as we as individuals need to be constantly assessing our heart, looking at where we need God's help, where we need change, where we can make adjustments to become a better, more useful tool in God's hand. So a church needs to be conscious of its tendencies, needs to recognize which direction it may lean. Why? So that they don't go too far. They don't fall off the edge. Again, the goal is to be right there in the middle, where you are accomplishing each of these tasks, each of these mandates that God has given the church, so that we can fulfill all of them, and thereby glorify God, fulfilling our purpose. We serve those within the church through those one another's, meeting those physical, emotional, and spiritual needs. But we also serve outwardly, looking to how we can be a light in the community by the love we have for one another and for others. We make sure that we are giving those who need it spiritual milk. We are presenting the gospel in a way that can be understood and helping the new believers, the baby Christians, to take their first steps. And yet at the same time, we don't leave them in that infantile state. We help them to grow in maturity. We recognize that there are members of the church at every stage of Christian maturity, both young and old. Those who need milk and those who need solid food. So the question, as we are going back to the very beginning of this series that we've been doing, looking at the purpose of the church. As you're answering those questions about you, we also need to look at our church as a whole. Where would you fit our church on this chart? And why? What are we good at? What do we do well? In what ways might we be failing? What aspects of the mandates of the church can we be better at? And how? And more importantly, how can you make that a reality? Because the church is not a separate entity to all of us. The church is us. The church is not the building, not the organization, not the tax-exempt code that we get from the government. The church is us, the assembly of believers, the body parts that God has brought together and assembled into Lowry Pilgrim Community Church. Are you functioning, as we read in Ephesians, as God has called you to? Serving in the church, not just being served. Are you growing to maturity? Are you serving in ways that are helping to mature others? Are you looking at meeting needs, both those within and those outside of the church? Teaching those here, but also preaching the truth to our community. Helping to make disciples. Because for a church to function, as Paul says in Ephesians 4, the whole body being fitted and held together by what every joint supplies, according to the proper working of each individual part, causes the growth of the body to the building up of itself in love.